McBride, I know Fred McBride already gave you a very thorough introduction to the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to start my story with Thornburg v. Gingles and the data that a minority group would need to show that they could satisfy the three prongs of Gingles. So the first prong is that you have to show that the minority community has to show that it is sufficiently large and geographically concentrated to form a majority of a single member district. The second prong is that the minority group must be politically cohesive. And the third, that the majority votes consistently as a bloc to defeat the minority preferred candidate. So let's start with the first one. In the first instance, you're going to have to show that the community is sufficiently large and geographically compact to make a majority-minority district. The irony of this is you might not need a majority-minority district to provide minorities with an opportunity to elect. So I see this more of a gatekeeping at this point, but originally the idea was if you couldn't draw a district that the minorities were a majority of the voters, then there was no remedy and there was no point in going forward with the case. Now, it's pretty simple in most respects to do this, especially nowadays where you can find the GIS online as well as the data online. You're going to use census population data by race and ethnicity. This data will come in the form of it's called the PL 94-171 data from the census. It's going to be down to the block level. And it is delayed this year, but we all have it now. Now, there are some complexities involved in this. Next slide. And the first is, if you're in an area with a minority group with a high number of non-citizens, several circuit courts have indicated that you're actually not interested in voting age population, you're interested in citizen voting age population. And the complexity comes in that will not be in the census enumeration data, the PL data, redistricting data. You're going to have to go to another source for that. It's a census source. It's called the American Community Survey. And the survey is a rolling survey. It's done every year with very few people, so that if you want to get the information that you need, you're going to have to use the 5-year ACS data. And the smallest unit for which you can get citizen voting age population is actually the block group, not the block. And most of you will be drawing at the block level. The second complication is, what does a majority mean? And Bartlett answered that for us by telling us it meant 50% of the voting age population, at least the Black voting age population in this North Carolina case. And again, in other jurisdictions, we know that it's 50% of the citizen voting age population. Okay, how do we go from the block group block if we are looking at drawing at the block level? We're going to have to produce some sort of algorithm that allows us to take the citizenship rate at the block group level and assign it to the block level. So that's the one complexity that comes into play when we're drawing. Okay, next slide. I think I covered that already. Yes, again, the ACS data is for a rolling 5-year period. The newest data has now been delayed. I think it's going to come out early next year, but the midpoint for that will be something like 2018 as opposed to 2020. It will not match the census data at 2020. Next slide. The second complexity is, can you combine minority groups? Can you, for example, combine Black voters and Hispanic voters in a single jurisdiction to meet the 50% mark? And the circuit courts have disagreed on this. The Fifth Circuit saying that you can. The Sixth Circuit saying you most definitely cannot. And then some circuits at least tacitly recognizing that these coalition claims can move forward, but not actually accepting any of them, either on the grounds that the minority group was not cohesive, or that the minority groups together, were not cohesive, or that voting was not actually polarized. Now, showing that minority groups are cohesive, that means that Black voters are cohesive amongst themselves, Hispanic voters are cohesive amongst themselves, and the Blacks and Hispanics together are cohesive, is not difficult when you're talking about general elections, but becomes more complex if you're in a situation, for example, in nonpartisan elections. But I think that the courts have at least accepted a coalition claim on a couple of instances. Okay, next slide. Circuit Court maps. Next slide. So the data required for the first prong is pretty straightforward, with a little wrinkle of how we're going to get citizenship data down at the block level. We're getting into a little more complicated territory when we're talking about the second and third prongs of Gingles. Remember, the second prong is that we have to show that minority voters are politically cohesive, that is, that they're voting for the same candidates. And the third prong, that whites are not supporting these candidates. And as a result, the minority preferred candidates are usually losing. We have a secret ballot here, so we don't actually know the race of the voter from the ballot, and we have to use estimation techniques to do this. And I think that a training session later on will actually talk about these estimation procedures. What I'm going to do today is just spend a few minutes talking about the data that's required to actually carry out this estimation procedure. Next slide. What you're going to be doing when you're doing a racial block voting analysis is you're going to be looking for patterns. Again, we don't have individual level data, although sometimes we do have access to survey data, and this can be used in some very limited circumstances. For the most part, we're going to be using aggregate level data to do this. And this is usually precincts. We're going to use election precincts, and we're going to look for patterns across these precincts, comparing the demographic composition of the precinct with the voting behavior in those precincts. So we need two pieces of information. We need the election results, and we need the demographic composition of these precincts. Next slide. So election results, where you're going to get the election results depends on actually what jurisdictions you are challenging. So if you're looking for drawings or looking at voting patterns at the level of the state, inevitably you can go to the Secretary of State or Board of Elections for that state and download the precinct election results you will need. They will have this online, and it's relatively straightforward to download it. It gets more complicated when we're talking about counties, but lots of larger counties at least have this online. Local jurisdictions, more complicated still. And having said that, in the instance of states, you can usually go online and get this information. It turns out that in some states that is complicated, and you do have to go county by county to get the election results that you're interested in, especially if you're interested in older election results or primary election results. We've run into trouble getting, although the actual results of the primaries are listed online, having to go county by county to actually get the election results by precinct for primary elections. Okay, next slide. What election results do you want to get? Well, the courts have indicated that the most probative contests are those contests that include minority candidates. You want contests that have African American or Hispanic or Asian candidates, because you don't want to have a situation where the only minority preferred candidates that can be consistently elected are white candidates. So you want to offer the option of minority candidates and see what happens. So the focus is on elections that include minority candidates as the most probative, but you still typically look at contests that include white candidates, only white candidates. If you're, for example, looking at statewide general elections or presidential elections, a lot of these elections don't include minority candidates, and you will probably still analyze them, remembering that the court is going to focus on and consider the most probative those that actually contain minority candidates. The second is whether you're going to look at endogenous or exogenous elections. By endogenous, we mean looking for the office at issue. So if you're looking at challenging a congressional plan, the most relevant elections to look at least in theory, are congressional elections. I say at least in theory because this is true if you're challenging an existing congressional district, but we're now in a situation where we're looking at proposed congressional districts. Now, those boundaries in most states will not have changed very much. So I would say that those would still be endogenous elections. But let's look at the state of Michigan that's drawing from scratch, and none of the state legislative districts look much like the state legislative districts did in the prior decade. Then it's somewhat ambiguous as to what an endogenous election versus an exogenous election is. But of course, we still looked at state legislative elections in Michigan. An exogenous election is any election that isn't for the office at issue. So if you're looking at challenging a state legislative plan, you might also look at statewide elections. You might look at congressional elections. If you have very few minority candidates, you might even look at county level elections. All of these elections would be considered exogenous. Now, the courts again have said that endogenous elections are the most relevant, and this is particularly true when you're challenging districts that have been in play for a while and you actually have elections to analyze for those districts. But sometimes those districts don't even have minority candidates who have competed, and then in that case, exogenous elections are going to be very important. Finally, in terms of recent and more dated elections, obviously the more recent in time, the better. But if you have minority candidates that have only competed, say, 6, 7, 8 years ago, then you're going to go back in time as long as it takes to get a sufficient number of elections that included minority candidates, if this is possible. Next slide. Some complexities in terms of election results. Well, one is elections in which voters can vote for more than one candidate. Now, there used to be provisions in many southern states against, say, anti-single shot voting, where you could go in and if there were 4 people up for election, you had to vote 4 times to elect these 4 candidates, and not just once to ensure that at least your candidate was elected and you didn't have to vote for other candidates as well. But now we're in a situation where we can look at the number of votes that are cast. We know the number of voters who turned out, but we don't know who, for example, chose to cast only 1 vote, who cast 2, who cast 3. So this makes it more complex. And another one that's growing increasingly large on the horizon is alternative voting systems. And what we're going to do, for example, when we won't go to analyze ranked choice voting schemes. And we're still thinking about how we're going to do this. We haven't had a challenge yet to a ranked choice election system, but this is going to be a big deal as more and more jurisdictions like New York City adopt these kind of election schemes. Next slide. Okay, here's the crux of this. Where are we going to get this data? Where are we going to find out the demographic composition of the precincts? This is the most complicated part, and we can see that there's a whole lot of options here. The closer you can get to the actual electorate, the better the analysis will be, the more accurate the analysis will be. So ideally, you want to be able to look at the racial composition of the actual turnout of those people who turned out to vote. And that's actually possible in a couple of systems that I'll describe. But I'm going to start out with the furthest away from the voters and work my way down. And the reason for that is actually most jurisdictions will be using voting age population as opposed to actual voters. If the state was engaged in the block boundary program, they will get back from the census data at the precinct level, or at least data at the precinct level as the precincts were defined using census blocks back in, well, for 2020, it would be in 2018. So the VTD data you get from the census in Census PL 171 data will be what blocks made up the election precincts in a frozen period of time, 2018. If your precincts were made up entirely of whole blocks and you haven't changed your precinct boundaries since 2018, you're golden. You have the data that you need to estimate the exact composition of your precinct. It gets a little more complicated, and we'll talk in a minute about what happens if the precinct boundaries did change, if the state wasn't involved in the block boundary program and nobody else picked up the pieces of that, or if, for example, the census blocks couldn't be used exactly to replicate the precinct boundaries. So this is the most common data that's used, is voting age population from the Census Redistricting database. Now, in areas with like a large number of Hispanics or Asians who are non-citizens, the preferred database when you're using voting age population is actually the citizen voting age population by precinct. To do that, we're going to go back again to the ACS citizenship data, and we're going to use it in conjunction with the PL data to estimate citizen voting age population at the block level. You could actually do it directly at the precinct level, or you could go to the block level and then bring it back up. The reason that it's usually done in the latter format was that you're also going to want citizen voting age population at the block level when you're drawing. So typically what's done is you take the ACS data at the block group level, You figure out you use an algorithm. One algorithm would be what is for that block group, what is the citizenship rate by race and ethnicity for the voting age population, and then take that rate and apply it to the blocks within the census block in the PL file. So that's one way to gather information on citizen voting age population. And then that's used for drawing, but then you would bring it back up to the precinct level to do a racial block voting analysis. You're going to want all your data at the precinct level. A little bit closer to the actual data is a number of jurisdictions, almost all southern jurisdictions, mainly in conjunction with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, collects registration by race. So when a voter goes in to register to vote, they also indicate their race or ethnicity. And the states, or sometimes you have to go to the county level, can get an indication of registration by race and ethnicity for those precincts. Sometimes it doesn't go back very far in time, but sometimes you can go back the entire decade, especially by going to the county level. So you can get voter registration data by race, so you're a little bit closer to the electorate than just voting age population. We can even get voter turnout data by race in some states. So when you go in and you register to vote, there's a big voter file out there, and it's got your name and your race, and it has whether you turned out to vote in any given election. And that voter file can be used to actually compile an indication of the turnout by race for any given contest that you're interested in analyzing. For those jurisdictions that don't, and this is most, that don't have, don't keep records of registration by race, another way to do this, especially, which was especially common in areas with Hispanic voters, is to use what's called a Spanish surname, the Spanish surname list. So the census, among the products the census offers, is a surname list. For everybody who indicated a surname more than, so if there are more than 100 times this name has been mentioned, it will come up in the surname list, and you will find out which, so here's a name, Brown, and 78% of the people named Brown were white. And I'm making these numbers up, but then 20% were indicated that they were Black, and 2% indicated that they were Hispanic. So we know we can assign a probability. And this began with the Spanish surname, because it turns out that the Spanish surnames are probably the most accurate way, the most accurate group of names within the census for determining probability. It used to be the case that it was as you'd either assign somebody as being Hispanic or not by picking a break point, like any name in which the probability of being Hispanic was, say, over 70%. You assign that person as Hispanic and all others as not. So it's a 0 or 1 situation. Either you were or you were not. So you use that in conjunction with the voter registration file to determine how many Hispanics and non-Hispanics you had in a precinct. More recently, we have taken the census surname, and it lists the probability for all races. And we can take that and we can use that to assign probabilities to any group of people. So if you're interested in a precinct and you have 100 people in there, for each name in there, you assign the probability of that person being a particular race based on their surname. And it's been improved by adding geocoding to this. So what we're going to do is for each name, we're going to know the probability assigned to it for each racial group. We're going to know their geocode, if they're geocoded. We're going to know where they live, and we're going to have a probability of them being a particular race or ethnicity based on where they live. And we're going to combine those two probabilities and get an indication of the racial makeup of a precinct based on surnames and geocoding. So those are, 6 possible ways of deriving information about the demographic composition of a precinct. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to end this with talking about some complications in producing this kind of information. I already talked about the fact that the data that you're going to get at the precinct level or the VTD level is going to reflect the precinct boundaries at a very specific point in time, usually 2018. If precinct boundaries have changed, or if you want to use election, let's say you're looking at elections back in 2014 or 2012, and the precincts don't look like they did by 2018. Or you want to look at elections in 2020 and the precincts changed between 2018 and 2020. Whenever the precinct boundaries changed, you only have a reflection of the composition of that precinct at one point of time, and you're going to have to find a way to determine what the composition of that precinct was, say in 2012 or 2014 versus in 2018. And the way to do that is through shapefiles. If you can get the shapefiles, you can take the shapefiles and look at what blocks made up that precinct at that particular point in time of the election, and produce a new set of numbers reflecting the actual composition at the time of the election before the precinct boundaries changed. It has proven to be a challenge to get shapefiles, especially shapefiles going back in time, but usually we're able to do it at least back a few elections. It's the further back in time you go, the less likely it is to be the case that you'll be able to get shapefiles. And it varies by state, it varies by county as to whether you'll be able to get it. One last thing I wanted to talk about before turning to questions is the disaggregation of election results down to the census blocks. This is a very useful tool for determining if a proposed district is likely to provide minority voters with an opportunity to elect. You identify through your racial block voting analysis some elections in which voting was polarized and the minorities supported with a great deal of cohesion a particular candidate, and you want to know what would happen in a district, in a new district in which an election hasn't occurred. Would that candidate carry that district? And the way to do that, unless you were drawing with precinct boundaries that didn't change over time, and you could just take the precincts, move them over into that district and add it up, the way you have to do that is you have to disaggregate the precinct results down to the block group, down to the block, so that you can bring it back up to reflect the composition of the newly proposed district. And you can do that on the grounds of voting age population. So if this block made up 20% of the precinct, they would get 20% of the votes for each of the candidates. Or if you've geocoded voters down to the block level, you will actually know that for this block, they made up 12% of the turnout in that particular election. And you can use this geocoded voters at the block level to actually look at recompiled election results. And I think that that's all I have, but yes, that's all I have. And would really welcome some questions from you so we can go further and talk about what particularly interests you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So how we're going to do this is if folks can actually put stack in the chat, this will allow me to call on you and then you can ask your question to Lisa. So this will just make it easier. If you have a question that you've been wanting to hold on to, put stack in the chat and I'll call on you and then we can get questions rolling underway. Great, Damien, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for giving the presentation today. I had something of a specific question regarding the elections that you choose under the Gingles II, III analysis. You had said that that the courts have found it most probative to focus on say biracial or interracial elections. I'm not sure which term, whether you maybe you'd use neither of those terms, but those are the terms I'm familiar with. And setting aside that at least there's one circuit which requires the inclusion in the analysis, can you say a little bit more about what the social science literature says about using elections in your Gingles II, III analysis that only have white candidates?
If I'm, yes, I have found myself looking at, for example, general elections, that the pattern that you find for white versus white contests is often slightly different than white versus black contests. For example, you might find that Democrats, white Democrats, will more willingly vote for a white Democrat than a black Democrat, so that the percentage of votes for the black Democrat is slightly lower than it would have been for the white Democrat. But it's really noticeable in places, in elections that are nonpartisan or in primaries, that you have a big difference when there's no partisan cue for voters to use as a shortcut for voting. You'll find that race could well be the cue that is used for casting a vote. And that's why it's important to make sure that you look at contests that include minority candidates to see if that, especially in instances where you don't have general elections, to see what voters are queuing off of. But again, I typically look, when I begin an analysis, I typically look at all statewide elections, even if there were no Hispanic or African-American candidates over the course of the decade, to just get a pattern of what's going on. And then if there was one or two, say out of a host of say 12 or 14 elections, it's important to see if there's if the voting pattern is slightly different in those elections than it is in white versus white elections. Now, some jurisdictions don't actually, I was working in a state in which there were no minority candidates. If you wanted to look at a statewide election, you had no choice but to look at white versus white contests. And I did. And voting wasn't particularly polarized in white versus white contests. But it's important to try and find out what's happening in contests with minority candidates and see if it looks a little bit different or a lot different.
If I could just do a quick follow-up, if that's okay. I guess, is there other data that you would use to tell you whether or not in a an election which only has white candidates, whether or not that's probative at all of minority preferences. So, given what you just said, for example, if there aren't any striking cues, then I could imagine, say, turnout would be particularly low in minority communities when there's only white candidates. But I'm making that up to a certain extent. Is there anything that would tell you whether or not you have something valuable in the data in those elections?
And you just mentioned something that's interesting. Another thing, in addition to looking at the voting patterns, I do always estimate the participation rates by race. So I do know if turnout is lower, for example, in a contest in which there are only white candidates, and that is something worth looking at. The chances are that is not the only person on the ballot. I mean, you'd be looking across years, so it's a little harder. It tells you something, but it's a little harder. Is there low turnout because it's a midterm election versus a presidential election, or is it low turnout because there were only whites in the 2018 versus the 2020 election? There could be complications with doing that, but yes, that is another factor that you could look at. You could also look at roll-off down the ballot. So for example, let's say you had a presidential race and a race for US Senate, and it turns out the presidential race only had white candidates, but the Senate race had a Black candidate, and actually Blacks were more likely to vote for that office than for the all-white office, and it would be just the opposite for white voters. That would be interesting to note as well.
Jennifer, I have you on stack.
Yeah, in our state, we do have race on the voter registration forms, but increasingly people are not filling that in, especially younger people. And I'm wondering what the implications of that are.
Yes, I have worked in a couple of states in which it used to be the case where you could assign about 95% of the voters to a group because they indicated their race when they registered to vote. And now you find about a fourth of the voters have put in like general or left it blank. And then depending on how many voters you have, you probably have to go to using voting age population as a backup, because you're going to do the analysis. Let's say, I'm simplifying it, but let's say you're in a jurisdiction and you can choose Black, white, or other. And originally, very few people chose other, and you could do your analysis. And over time, now your other category is much larger, and you're going to do your analysis using Black, white, and other, and you don't really know who the others are. But if the voting pattern is more similar to Black or more similar to white, you might be able to guess. Or you go to voting age population to check what you have to make sure that you're not getting something different when you're using voting age population using registration. I'm not sure that we've been in a jurisdiction that the number of registered voters not indicating your race has been so high that the data has become less useful. I mean, it's become less useful, but it isn't useful at all. Let me put it that way.
Kathy asks, you mentioned that the Census Bureau is now geocoding racial probability of surnames. Very helpful. How far back does that data go?
I think it goes back quite a ways. I mean, I think maybe as far, well, certainly, I think at least as far back as the 1990s, because we started using the Spanish surname component of that in the 1990s, or even before that, I think.
Oh, she says, sorry, beyond Spanish.
I think that we've always the list was always compiled for everybody. We just started using Spanish surnames. But I think that it's always, for as long as we've had it, they've collected that information for everybody. In other words, it wasn't just Spanish names. You gave your name and they indicated, you know, in this big file, the racial composition of the people who indicated that was their name. It's just that we first started using it for the identifying Hispanics, but I think that it has always been the case that we knew the composition of the people who indicated that was their surname for as long as we used Spanish surname, but we knew it for all of them. We just didn't, it becomes more accurate for other groups when you add the geocoded component to it. So for example, we have, until we had BISG available to us, we didn't tend to use the Black and white voters' names. We didn't tend to use that without the geocoding aspect added to it.
Blake, I have you on stack.
Thank you. I apologize if I missed this earlier. I was a little bit distracted at the beginning, but I'm wondering about sources to determine the races of candidates in contests. How do you know if the candidates in a given contest might be whatever race or ethnicity? Thank you.
That varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, if you're working, say, for a state legislature, you usually go to state legislators to help you identify. I mean, it is literally, it is a matter of whatever sources you can use in a particular jurisdiction are the sources that you use. This usually doesn't fall to the political scientist. This falls to the commission or the legislature or the lawyers who are doing the case to identify the race of the candidates. Now, it may be the case if you're in a jurisdiction in the South and this candidate has registered to vote, you can find out their race or the race they indicated on the voter registration list. But otherwise, it varies from state to state, and there's no foolproof way of doing this.
Louisa, I have you on stack.
Thank you, Dr. Handley. I wanted to know if you could provide some background on your guidance to the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission.
Probably not. Probably not. I mean, I gave some presentations, which are public knowledge. I did racial bloc voting analysis of statewide and state legislative contests and provided the results to them. And all of that is pretty much available online on the Michigan Redistricting Commission. Most, what I don't even know is I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist. So I analyze voting patterns and then I provide my results to the commissioners and to the lawyers. And then it's up to the lawyers to tell them what's legal and what's not legal. So I would say for the most part, you know what I told them because it's there in the presentation. Everything that I said to them is public.
Rebecca says, you mentioned in Gingles 1 that it's more difficult to show 50% criterion satisfied in primary elections versus generals. Why is that?
In the second and the third prong, not in the first prong. Did you say the first prong?
I'm here. I was taking notes and I just wrote why primary is more difficult to show. You made a side comment about after you talked about the ACS and if it's okay to form, oh, it was about forming coalitions between interest groups.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot to add that in the
Okay. Yes, in terms of coalition groups, it tends to be the case that minorities are very cohesive in general elections. They tend to vote Democratic, heavily Democratic. So, but in primaries, it's without a party queue, it's harder to show cohesion. If, for example, there is a single minority candidate of whichever group, let's say you're trying to show that Blacks and Hispanics are, and you have some Black candidate running and both Blacks and Hispanics support them, that's a good way to show cohesion. But let's say you have a Black and an Hispanic both running in the primary, and Hispanics vote for Hispanics and Blacks vote for Blacks, then it's a little more complicated how you're going to argue that they're cohesive. So my point really was it's usually very easy to show that minorities are cohesive in general elections because you have a party queue and they're going to vote more likely than not for the Democratic candidate. And it's a little tougher to show it in the primary. But if you can show it, then you can win in the circuits that accept it. You have a chance of winning demonstrating the second prong of Gingles. But the point is that you have to show that Hispanics and Black voters support the same candidates, both in the generals and in primaries. And that's the harder part. Is that a little clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Take one more question. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask. Gracie, Sarah, sorry about that. Sarah asked, do you know of any jurisdictions that have demonstrated a Black Asian coalition?
I do not, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I don't know.
Louita says we are building one in Detroit. But we could take one more question. All right, I think we are good to go. Again, I just want to give a huge applause and thank you to Lisa for today's presentation. Thank you so much for coming out today. Definitely really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording now.